Gerald sat in the shadows of the basement, his hands, calloused, grease-stained, and trembling slightly with the onset of age, resting on a workbench made of reclaimed timber. Above him, the ceiling groaned under the weight of 100 footsteps. The mansion, a Georgian-style masterpiece he had designed and paid for 30 years ago, was vibrating with the pulse of electronic dance music and the high-pitched chatter of people who didn't know his name. His son, Mark, was hosting a launch gala. The invitation, which Gerald had found in the trash, described it as a celebration of visionary innovation and the future of tech. At 65, Gerald was no longer part of that future. To Mark and his wife, Elena, Gerald was a relic, a piece of architectural history that had become an architectural eyesore. They had moved him to the basement 6 months ago, claiming the stairs were too much for his heart. But Gerald knew the truth. He was a ghost that ruined the aesthetic of their perfect, modern life. The basement was cold, smelling of damp earth and WD-40. It was filled with what Mark called junk, antique clocks with broken springs, short-circuited radios from the 50s, and boxes of rusted gears. To Gerald, these weren't junk. They were puzzles. They were broken things waiting for a second chance. "Everything can be fixed," Gerald whispered to the empty room. His voice was a gravelly rasp and used for days. "If you just have the patience to find where it snapped." Suddenly, the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A shaft of brilliant, warm light cut through the dusty gloom of the basement, followed by the sharp click-clack of Elena's designer heels. She didn't come all the way down. She stayed on the middle step, as if touching the basement floor would stain her silk gown. "Gerald?" she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that couldn't hide her irritation. "Are you making that noise again?" The guests can hear the metallic clinking through the vents. "It's distracting." Gerald didn't look up from a copper gear he was cleaning. "I'm just working, Elena. Working." She let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "You're playing with trash, Gerald. Mark is upstairs closing a multi-million-dollar deal with investors who believe in real engineering. Please, for one night, try to be invisible. We have a reputation to maintain." "This house was built on my reputation," Gerald said quietly. Elena stiffened. "That was a long time ago. The world has moved on. Don't make us regret letting you stay here." She turned and vanished, slamming the door. The darkness felt heavier than before. Gerald sighed, the sound echoing against the stone walls. He stood up, his knees popping like dry twigs, and decided to clear some space on his secondary bench. That was when he saw it. Sitting atop an overflowing black garbage bag near the service exit was a flash of polished mahogany and inlaid mother-of-pearl. Gerald's heart skipped a beat. He lunged forward, his movements more fluid than they had been in years. He pulled the object from the trash. It was a music box, small, delicate, and handcrafted. It had been his wedding gift to his late wife, Martha. It was the only thing he had asked to keep in his room when they moved him downstairs. It was ruined. The lid had been ripped off its hinges. The delicate porcelain ballerina that used to twirl to the tune of Clair de Lune was decapitated, her tiny white arms shattered into dust. The velvet lining had been soaked in what smelled like expensive champagne. Gerald felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the basement air. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. Mark and Elena hadn't just thrown it away. They had destroyed it first. They wanted to erase Martha. They wanted to erase the last thread of sentiment that tied Gerald to the world above. He sat back down at his bench, the broken box cradled in his palms. Above him, he heard a muffled roar of laughter and the clinking of crystal flutes. He could almost hear Mark's voice, boasting about efficiency and disrupting the market. Gerald looked at the headless ballerina. He looked at the bent brass pins of the musical cylinder. To anyone else, it was a total loss. A tragedy of wood and wire. But Gerald's eyes began to sharpen. The grief in his chest didn't dissipate. It transformed. It hardened into a cold, crystalline focus. He reached for his finest set of jeweler's screwdrivers and a magnifying glass. "You think it's over," he murmured, his shadow stretching long and jagged against the wall as the light from his single desk lamp flickered. "You think because something is broken, it's useless." He picked up a tiny, precision-ground file. "You've forgotten who I am, Mark. You've forgotten that I didn't just build this house. I designed the foundations. I know where the load-bearing walls are. I know where the wires scream when they're overloaded. and I know how to make a machine run until it explodes." He carefully set the music box on a velvet cloth. His hands, which had been trembling only moments ago, were now as steady as a surgeon's. "Everything can be fixed," Gerald repeated, but this time his voice held a terrifying edge of iron. "But some things need to be broken down completely before they can be rebuilt." He began to work. Upstairs, the party reached its crescendo. People toasted to the future, to wealth, and to the brilliance of a son who had successfully managed his aging father. They laughed, oblivious to the man in the dark below them. They didn't realize that the garbage king had just found his first project. The music box would play again, but the tune it would play wouldn't be a lullaby. It would be a requiem for the life they thought they had stolen from him. Gerald felt a grim smile tug at the corners of his mouth. The repairman was open for business, and his first customer was going to pay a price they couldn't possibly imagine. Everything can be fixed, even a son, even if it required the most painful kind of surgery. Gerald picked up the screwdriver and began to disassemble the first gear. The revolution had started in the trash. The dampness of the basement seemed to recede as Gerald worked, replaced by the dry, metallic heat of his focused mind. For 3 days, he had not left his subterranean sanctuary. He survived on tap water and the stale protein bars he had stashed in his toolbox months ago. Above him, the mansion had grown quiet. The visionaries had moved on to their offices downtown, leaving Gerald alone with the ghosts of things that used to work. His secondary workbench was no longer a graveyard. It was an operating table. Dozens of discarded items, things Elena had deemed clutter and tossed into the service hallway, lay dissected under his lamp. There was an old digital tablet with a cracked screen, a high-end baby monitor that static-filled ears couldn't stand, and a series of smart home sensors that had been replaced by a newer, shinier model. To Mark and Elena, these were dead electronics. To Gerald, they were a nervous system. He spent hours hunched over the tablet. The screen was shattered, yes, but the motherboard was humming with life. Using a soldering iron with the precision of a master weaver, Gerald bypassed the broken display and tethered the device to an old desktop monitor he'd salvaged from a neighbor's curb. "Let's see what you're so proud of, Mark," Gerald whispered, his eyes narrowing as lines of code began to scroll across the flickering screen. As the former chief engineer of a firm that built skyscrapers, Gerald understood systems. He understood that every bridge has a resonance frequency, a specific vibration that, if hit correctly, can bring the entire structure down. He wasn't looking for money. He was looking for the resonance frequency of Mark's lies. While the rest of the world saw Mark as a tech prodigy, Gerald found the digital fingerprints of a desperate man. Mark's visionary software, a logistics platform meant to revolutionize shipping, was a patchwork of stolen open-source code and fake data. But deeper than that, hidden in the cache of the discarded tablet, Gerald found the Black Ledger. It was a series of encrypted spreadsheets. Mark hadn't just been faking progress. He had been siphoning off investor funds to pay for the very mansion Gerald was currently sitting beneath. The gala hadn't been a celebration. It had been a lure for one last big fish before the house of cards collapsed. Gerald leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his weary eyes. He could stop this. He could take this data to the authorities. But as he looked at the decapitated ballerina music box sitting finished on his desk, now perfectly restored, her porcelain head reattached with a seam so fine it looked like a silk choker, he realized that justice and repair were two different things. A machine doesn't learn if you fix it for them, he thought. The machine only learns if it hits the red line and feels the heat. He turned his attention to the broken baby monitor. Elena had complained it was glitchy, hearing voices through the white noise. Gerald stripped it down. It wasn't glitchy, it was high frequency. It was picking up the neighbor's unencrypted security feeds and, more interestingly, the internal intercom system Mark had installed for their private conversations. Gerald didn't just repair the monitor. He enhanced it. He tuned the copper coils and replaced the cheap capacitors with high-grade ones from an old radio. Suddenly, the basement wasn't silent anymore. The speakers crackled to life. "Don't care if he's comfortable, Elena." Mark's voice boomed through the basement, distorted but unmistakable. Asterisk, "The bank is breathing down my neck. If we don't clear the basement for the cellar expansion, the appraisers won't give us the bridge loan. We need him gone by Friday. Asterisk, Asterisk, what about the facility in the valley? Asterisk, Elena's voice followed, cold and clinical. Asterisk, it's cheap. Far enough away that we don't have to visit every weekend. He's losing his mind anyway, Mark. He spends all day talking to his tools. Asterisk. Friday, Mark echoed. Asterisk, I'll tell him it's a vacation. By the time he realizes he's not coming back, the locks will be changed. Asterisk. Gerald sat perfectly still. The soldering iron in his hand stayed steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked around his workshop, his world of junk. He realized then that he wasn't just repairing objects. He was gathering the parts of a mirror that would show his son exactly who he had become. While they planned his exile, Gerald began a new project. He took the smart home sensors and began reprogramming them. He didn't want to break their house. He wanted to make it honest. He wanted the lights to flicker when a lie was told. He wanted the doors to lock when a thief entered the room. He wanted the very walls he had designed to turn against the inhabitants who had desecrated them. Every night, while the house slept, Gerald moved like a phantom through the service vents, channels he had included in the original blueprints for future-proofing. He planted the sensors. He tapped into the main server. He was weaving a web of accountability, stitch by agonizing stitch. He returned to his bench just as the sun began to bleed through the high, barred windows of the basement. He picked up the restored music box. He wound the key. The mechanism turned. The ballerina began to twirl. The melody, asterisk Claire de Lune asterisk, floated through the damp air, haunting and pure. It was a beautiful sound, but in the context of the basement, it sounded like a countdown. You think I'm a ghost, Mark, Gerald said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves. But you forgot the most important rule of engineering. He watched the ballerina spin. Ghosts don't break things. They just remind you of what's already broken. He reached out and stopped the ballerina with one finger. The music died instantly. Above him, he heard the muffled sound of Elena's alarm clock. The day had begun. The final week of his life in this house had started. In the world above, they were preparing a cage for an old man. In the world below, the old man was preparing a reckoning. Gerald picked up his screwdriver. He had 5 days. It was more than enough time to fix a soul or finish breaking one. He began to whistle the tune of the music box, a dry, tuneless sound that was lost in the roar of the mansion's ventilation system. While they prepared to throw him away, Gerald was ensuring that when he left, he would take the soul of the house with him. He wasn't just a repairman anymore. He was the architect of the fallout. Thursday arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. In the world above, the mansion was a whirlwind of activity. Gerald could hear the heavy thud of boots, professional movers. They weren't there to pack his memories. They were there to clear the obstructive mass from the basement to make room for Mark's new climate-controlled wine cellar. Gerald sat at his workbench, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the door. He had dressed in his best wool suit, the one he had worn to Martha's funeral. It was frayed at the cuffs, but it was clean. On the table before him sat the restored music box and the baby monitor, now a silent sentinel of his own making. The door at the top of the stairs didn't just open, it was flung back. Mark stepped down, his face a mask of practiced sympathy that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. Behind him stood 2 burly men in gray uniforms, looking uncomfortable as they surveyed the cramped, tool-filled space. "Dad," Mark said, his voice echoing with a hollow resonance. "We talked about this. The doctor said the dampness down here is affecting your lungs. Elena and we've found a wonderful place for you. The Heritage Valley Estate. It's got gardens, 24-hour care, people your own age." Gerald didn't blink. Heritage Valley is a warehouse for the forgotten, Mark. I designed the ventilation system for their East Wing 20 years ago. It's built to keep the smell of bleach in and the sound of crying out. Mark's jaw tightened. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "It's for your own good. We've already signed the papers. The movers are here to take your belongings. Well, the things worth keeping. And the rest?" Gerald asked softly. Mark glanced at the piles of salvaged gears and the flickering monitors. "The rest is junk, Dad. It's clutter. It's time to let go of the past." One of the movers reached for a stack of Gerald's architectural blueprints, hand-drawn vellum sheets that represented a lifetime of integrity. "Don't touch those," Gerald said. The command was quiet, but it had the weight of a falling steel beam. The mover froze. Mark let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Look at you, clinging to paper and rusted iron while the world passes you by. You're 65, Dad. You're obsolete. Your integrity didn't pay for this house. My innovation did. Innovation. Gerald stood up slowly. He seemed to grow taller in the dim light, his shadow cast long and sharp against the stone wall. Is that what you call siphoning investor funds into a private offshore account? Is that what you call faking the stability algorithms for your shipping software? The color drained from Mark's face. He stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. You don't know what you're talking about. You're senile. You're hearing things. I hear everything, Gerald replied. He picked up the modified baby monitor. This house has ears, Mark. I built it that way. I heard you and Elena planning my vacation. I heard you laughing about how easy it was to break Martha's music box. Elena appeared at the top of the stairs, her silhouette sharp against the light. Mark, just get him out of here. The appraisers will be here in an hour. We don't have time for his delusions. Mark grabbed Gerald by the arm. It wasn't a gentle lead, it was a shove. Get out. Now. You can take your suit and your pride, but everything else stays. It's my house. My name is on the deed. Gerald stumbled slightly, but didn't fall. He looked at his son, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, the man he had hoped would carry his legacy. He saw nothing but a hollow shell of greed. You're right, Mark, Gerald said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a chilling finality. The house is yours, but a house is just a machine for living. And you've forgotten how to maintain the engine. As the movers began to toss Gerald's tools into heavy plastic bins, the sound of metal clashing like a funeral knell, Mark dragged his father toward the service exit. They didn't even take him through the front door. They led him out through the rain-slicked driveway where a black sedan waited. You're making a mistake, Gerald said as the cold rain began to soak into his suit. The mistake was letting you stay this long, Mark snapped. He signaled the driver. Take him to the valley. Don't stop for anything. As the car pulled away, Gerald looked back through the rear window. He saw Mark and Elena standing on the porch of the great mansion, looking like royalty surveying their kingdom. They looked victorious. They looked untouchable. But Gerald reached into his pocket and felt the small, cold shape of a remote trigger he had fashioned from a garage door opener and the discarded sensors. He didn't press it. Not yet. While the car sped away into the gray veil of the storm, Gerald looked at his hands. They were empty of tools, but they were steady. He felt the weight of the restored music box hidden in his inner coat pocket, the only piece of his heart he had managed to save. He wasn't going to Heritage Valley. He had already redirected the driver's GPS via the tablet he'd hidden in the trunk. The car was headed to a small, unassuming workshop in the industrial district, a place owned by a man who still owed Gerald a debt from 30 years ago. Everything can be fixed, Gerald whispered to the glass of the window, his breath fogging the view of the receding mansion. Inside the house, a small red light began to blink on the main server rack in the basement. A line of code, hidden deep within the home's operating system, began to execute. It wasn't a virus. It was an audit. Every lie Mark had told, every cent he had stolen, was being compiled into a single, unerasable file, addressed to the Securities and Exchange Commission and every major news outlet in the city. The hook was set. Gerald leaned back into the leather seat. He was homeless, cast out by his own blood into a world that didn't want him. But as the music box in his pocket gave a single, faint ting, Gerald knew the truth. He wasn't the one who was lost. Mark and Elena were still in the house, celebrating their cleansing. They didn't realize that they were trapped inside a machine that was about to scream. They didn't realize that while they were throwing their father into the cold, they had invited the reckoning to dinner. The rain turned to sleet, rattling against the car like a million tiny hammers. Gerald closed his eyes. The repairman was gone. The architect had left the building. And now, the demolition could begin. The car didn't go to Heritage Valley. While the driver stared in confusion at a GPS screen that seemed to have developed a mind of its own, Gerald sat in the back, watching the luxury of the suburbs dissolve into the rusted iron and cracked concrete of the industrial district. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had rewritten the destination in the car's software 2 nights ago, buried deep within a routine maintenance update he'd helped the local mechanic with. They pulled up in front of a sprawling, soot-stained warehouse. A sign hung crookedly over the steel door, Miller's Heavy Machinery and Salvage. "This isn't the valley," the driver muttered, his voice trembling. "Sir, I need to call Mr. Mark." "You can try," Gerald said, stepping out into the biting sleet. "But I suspect his phone is currently receiving about 4,000 automated spam calls a minute. A small glitch I left behind. Now leave. You've done your job." The driver, spooked by the old man's eerie calm, didn't argue. The sedan sped away, splashing gray slush onto Gerald's polished shoes. Gerald pushed open the heavy steel door. Inside, the air smelled of ozone, burnt oil, and history. The warehouse was a cathedral of discarded giants, obsolete factory presses, stripped-down turbines, and skeletal remains of cranes. At the far end, under a halo of flickering fluorescent lights, a man with white hair and grease-stained overalls was hammering at a stubborn gasket. "I told you the part wouldn't be here until Tuesday, Sam," the man yelled without looking up. "It's not Sam, Elias," Gerald said. The hammering stopped. Elias Miller turned slowly, his eyes widening behind thick goggles. He wiped his hands on a rag that was blacker than the floor. "Gerald? Gerald Bennett? Good God. Man, I heard you'd gone senile. That Mark had you tucked away in some basement." "I was in a basement," Gerald said, walking toward the workbench. "But I wasn't senile. I was studying." Elias looked at Gerald's expensive, soaked suit, then at the sharp, predatory clarity in his old friend's eyes. "You look like a man who just walked out of his own funeral." "I did. And now, I'm here to collect a debt." 30 years ago, Gerald had saved Elias's business from a hostile takeover by redesigning their entire manufacturing line for free. Elias had never forgotten. He didn't ask questions. He simply cleared a corner of the warehouse, hooked up a high-powered server, and gave Gerald the keys to the most advanced CNC machines and diagnostic tools in the city. For the next 48 hours, Gerald didn't sleep. While the winter storm outside grew into a monster, Gerald built a sanctuary. He wasn't alone for long. He knew where the others were, the obsolete ones. He made a few calls to men he'd worked with decades ago, retired electrical engineers, blacklisted IT specialists, and veteran mechanics who had been replaced by younger, cheaper versions of themselves. "They think we're junk," Gerald told them as they gathered around a makeshift heater in the cold warehouse. "They think because our hair is gray and our joints ache, we no longer understand how the world turns. But we built the world they're currently breaking." While Mark and Elena were upstairs in their mansion, frantically trying to figure out why their bank accounts were frozen and why their proprietary software was sending gibberish to their clients, Gerald's team was building something new. They weren't building a weapon. They were building a resurrection hub. Gerald used the data he'd siphoned from Mark's discarded tablet to map out every single victim of his son's fraudulent shipping platform. Small business owners, independent truckers, and local warehouses that had been squeezed dry by Mark's innovation. "We're going to fix their logistics," Gerald said, his fingers flying across a keyboard with a speed that defied his age. "While Mark's system crashes, we're going to launch a shadow network. We'll use the old frequencies, the backup servers, the hardware they threw in the trash. We're going to keep the city moving while his empire goes dark." But survival wasn't the only goal. In the corner of the workshop, Gerald spent his few resting minutes on a special project. He had taken the high-frequency baby monitor and the smart home sensors he'd retrieved before leaving the mansion. He was building a master key. While Elias and the others worked on the logistics network, Gerald focused on the music box. He had added a small, nearly invisible modification to its base, a long-range transmitter. "Everything can be fixed," he whispered, staring at the ballerina as she twirled in the dim light of the warehouse. "But sometimes, to fix a house, you have to burn the rot out of the wood first." The sleet turned to a heavy, suffocating snow. The city began to grind to a halt. Power grids flickered. Supply chains buckled. Above the city, in the luxury high-rises and suburban mansions, the visionaries panicked. They had built a world that relied on flawless code and constant connectivity. They had no backup, no plan B. But in a drafty warehouse in the industrial district, a group of old men were drinking bitter coffee and watching monitors that glowed with a steady, unbreakable light. They were the ones keeping the food trucks moving and the hospital generators fueled. They were the ghosts in the machine. The hook of Part 4 came at midnight on the second day. Elias walked over to Gerald, holding a tablet. "Gerald, you need to see this. The news just broke." Mark's company, it's not just failing. It's being liquidated. The SEC issued an emergency injunction. But there's something else. He turned the screen toward Gerald. It was a live feed from a news helicopter, hovering over the Bennett mansion. The house was dark, except for a frantic, rhythmic flickering of the lights in the master bedroom. He's trapped, Elias said. The smart home system you tweaked, it's locked the doors. The security shutters are down. He can't get out, and the police can't get in because the electronic locks are encrypted with a code they can't break. Gerald looked at the screen. He saw the house he had built, now turned into a fortress or a prison. He felt a pang of something, not regret, but a deep, sorrowful justice. He wanted to lock me in the dark, Gerald said quietly. Now he gets to see what the dark feels like. Suddenly, Gerald's own phone buzzed. It was an unrecognized number. He answered. Dad? Dad, please. Mark's voice was hysterical, barely audible over the sound of a blaring alarm in the background. Elena is screaming. The house won't stop. The lights, the noise. It's playing that music, Dad. That damn music box song is coming out of every speaker. How do I stop it? Please, tell me how to stop it. Gerald looked at the music box on his bench. The ballerina twirled, silent and graceful. I told you, Mark, Gerald said, his voice as cold as the snow piling up outside the warehouse. I don't fix junk anymore. And right now, you're the most broken thing I've ever seen. Gerald ended the call. He didn't look at the screen again. He turned back to his workbench and picked up a rusted gear from a pile of salvage. While the world he had created crumbled around his son, Gerald began to clean the rust away, one tooth at a time. The repairman was busy. He had a city to save, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel old at all. He felt like a man who had finally found the right tool for the job. The silence in the warehouse was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of cooling fans and the distant, rhythmic clinking of Elias's tools. Gerald stood before the master console, his face illuminated by a mosaic of data streams. He wasn't looking at stock prices or bank balances anymore. He was watching a map of the city's pulse. While the modern infrastructure, the cloud-based logistics, and the AI-driven delivery routes shuddered and died under the weight of the storm and Mark's corrupted code, Gerald's ghost network was flickering to life. It was a patchwork system built on the bones of analog radio frequencies and discarded local servers, but it had one thing Mark's system lacked: resilience. They're calling it the digital blackout, Elias said, leaning over Gerald's shoulder with a mug of bitter coffee. The newspapers are saying Mark's company was the patient zero. When his fraud was exposed, the panic triggered a massive sell-off, and his automated recovery protocols turned into a virus. It's eating the industry from the inside out. Gerald's fingers danced across the keyboard. It's not a virus, Elias. It's a mirror. The system is simply reacting to the void where the integrity should have been. It's trying to find a solid foundation, and it's finding nothing but air. Suddenly, the large screen in the center of the warehouse flickered. It was a news broadcast, being fed through a pirate signal Gerald had tapped into. The headline read, Empire in Ruins, Bennett Mansion Under Siege. The footage, captured by a drone struggling against the wind, showed the mansion, Gerald's masterpiece, looking like a dark, jagged tooth against the snow. There were no lights in the windows, only the frantic, strobe-like flashing of the security system Gerald had modified. But then, the camera zoomed in on the front gates. A crowd had gathered. Not a crowd of reporters, but a crowd of the discarded. Truckers who had lost their pensions because of Mark's efficiency models. Small business owners whose warehouses had been foreclosed on. They were standing in the snow, holding signs, their faces grim. They weren't there to protest. They were there to witness the fall. Inside that house, Gerald knew, Mark and Elena were experiencing a very specific kind of hell. They weren't just trapped. They were being forced to listen. Gerald had programmed the home's audio system to play a loop of the recorded conversations he'd captured, the moments where they laughed about dumping the old man and liquidating the junk. Their own voices were screaming back at them from every wall, a surround sound indictment of their souls. It's time, Gerald said, his voice barely a whisper. Time for what? Elias asked. The restoration, Gerald replied. Mark thinks he's lost everything because his money is gone. He doesn't realize that loss is just the removal of an illusion. I'm going to show him what's actually left. Gerald opened a high-level command prompt. He didn't send a destructive command. Instead, he sent a release signal. Back at the mansion, the heavy steel security shutters, the ones that had turned the house into a tomb, slowly began to grind upward. The electronic locks clicked open. The blaring sirens died down, replaced by a deafening, heavy silence. From his console, Gerald watched the drone feed. He saw the front doors of the mansion swing wide. Mark stumbled out into the snow, looking like a ghost of the man he had been 3 days ago. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes were wide with a terror that transcended financial ruin. He looked at the crowd at his gates, then looked up at the sky, as if searching for a god he had never believed in. But Gerald wasn't finished. While the world watched Mark's humiliation, Gerald redirected the ghost network. With a single keystroke, he transferred the decrypted Black Ledger, the proof of Mark's crimes, not to the police, but to a public blockchain where it could never be deleted, hidden, or bribed away. "You're not just breaking him, Gerald," Elias noted, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and fear. "You're erasing his ability to ever lie again." "I'm fixing the record," Gerald corrected. "A machine can't function if the blueprints are false. Neither can a life." The hook of Part 5 arrived when Gerald's screen suddenly turned blood red. A secondary alert popped up, a silent alarm he had installed in the mansion's foundation years ago, one that even Mark didn't know existed. The sensors were detecting a massive thermal spike in the basement. "The wine cellar," Gerald muttered, his heart skipping a beat. "The construction crew, they must have nicked the main gas line or bypassed the old pressure valves to install those cooling units Mark wanted." Because the house was now unlocked and the smart system was disabled, the automated fire suppression wouldn't trigger. The house wasn't just a prison anymore, it was a bomb. Gerald grabbed his old work coat, the one Elena had tried to burn. "Where are you going?" Elias shouted. "The storm is at its peak. You can't get there." "I built that house," Gerald shouted back, his eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying vitality. "I know how to stop the bleed. Mark is a fool, but he's still my son. And Elena, she's someone's daughter." "Gerald, it's suicide." "No," Gerald said, pausing at the heavy steel door of the warehouse. He held up the restored music box. "It's a repair, and a master repairman never leaves a job half done." He stepped out into the whiteout, the wind howling like a wounded beast. Behind him, the warehouse monitors continued to glow, showing the world a path back to sanity. But ahead of him, in the heart of the storm, the mansion, his greatest creation and his greatest sorrow, was beginning to glow with a different, more lethal light. While the visionaries had fled to their bunkers and the innovators sat paralyzed by their own failures, a 65-year-old man, with a music box in his pocket and a wrench in his hand, began to walk toward the fire. He wasn't going back to reclaim his wealth. He was going back to see if there was anything left in the ruins worth saving. As he disappeared into the snow, the only sound was the faint, haunting tinkling of Clair de Lune, playing against the roar of the gale. The repairman was on his way, and this time, he was bringing the truth with him. Con bao tuet gao that nu mot con k vat by Thuong Kai Gerald TNV, if I ngoi beat Thursday. On Lua du Ruk Tu Tang Hem Bat, Dao Lin Qua and Hung O Qua, So Kin Quang Luke. Bien Tuet Trang Ton and Hung Hat Bui Tiaro Ton. Dui De La Noi Dung Fan 6. The drive to the mansion was a blur of white madness. Gerald pushed Elias's old rugged truck through drifts that would have buried a lesser vehicle. His heart, the very organ Mark had claimed was too weak for stairs, was drumming a steady, warlike rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't an old man anymore. He was a creator returning to his forge. As he pulled into the long, winding driveway, the scene was chaotic. The crowd of the discarded had retreated from the gates as the smell of gas and the glow of fire grew too intense. Police cruisers and a single fire engine were stalled at the entrance, their tires spinning uselessly in the unplowed snow. "It's going to blow," someone yelled through the gale. Gerald didn't stop. He drove the truck straight over the curb, bypassing the jammed gates, and roared across the frozen lawn until he slammed to a halt mere feet from the front mahogany doors. He stepped out, the heat from the house hitting him like a physical blow. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wine and burning insulation. "Dad!" A scream pierced the roar of the wind. Gerald turned to see Mark and Elena huddled near the garage, shivering in their thin evening wear. Mark's face was smeared with soot, his eyes wide with a primal, pathetic terror. He was clutching a leather briefcase, likely the last of his hard drives, as if it could save him from the frost. "Don't go in there," Mark sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand. "The basement is a furnace. The system won't let us back in to shut off the main valve." Gerald looked at his son, then at the house. "The system is doing exactly what it was told to do, Mark. It's reacting to the pressure you put on it." Without another word, Gerald turned toward the house. He didn't use the front door. He knew the expansion joints of the structure better than his own skin. He ran toward the side service entrance, the one he'd been forced to use for months. Inside, the heat was suffocating. The smart lights were flickering in a death spasm, casting long, jerky shadows. The sound was the worst part, a deep, tectonic groaning of metal expanding too fast. Gerald reached the basement door. The electronic lock was red, fused shut by the heat. He didn't reach for a key. He pulled a heavy pipe wrench from his coat, a tool Elena had called disgusting junk, and smashed the keypad with a single, practice strike. He then jammed a crowbar into the seam and heaved. The door groaned and gave way. The basement was a vision of hell. The luxury wine cellar Mark had installed was a twisted wreck of shattered glass and pressurized spray. A gas line near the new cooling unit had ruptured, and a small, concentrated jet of flame was roaring like a blowtorch against the main wooden support beam of the house. If that beam charred through, the entire center of the mansion would collapse inward, burying everyone and everything within it. Gerald pulled his wet wool coat over his head and lunged through the smoke. He wasn't looking for the digital override. He was looking for the manual bypass, the old, brass wheel valve he had insisted on installing 30 years ago, despite the contractors saying it was redundant in the age of sensors. He found it behind a sleek, melted plastic panel. The brass was scorching. Gerald grabbed the wheel. His skin hissed as it touched the metal. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up his arms, but he didn't let go. He planted his feet in the rising water on the floor and hauled back. "Turn," he hissed through gritted teeth. "You built this to last. Now prove it." With a scream of protesting metal, the valve groaned. One turn. Two. The roar of the gas flame began to lose its pitch, fading from a scream to a hiss, and finally, to a whisper. The fire didn't go out, but the bomb had been defused. Gerald slumped against the cold stone wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were blistered, raw and weeping, but he didn't feel the pain yet. He looked around the ruined basement. In the corner, his old workbench, the one the movers hadn't reached yet, stood miraculously untouched by the fire. Sitting on it was the small, decapitated porcelain head of the ballerina that had shattered during the move. He picked it up, tucking it into his pocket. Above him, the house felt silent. The rhythmic flickering of the lights had stopped. The ghost network had finished its job. The truth was out, the fraud was documented, and the fire was contained. Gerald walked back up the stairs, his steps slow and heavy. When he emerged from the house, the firemen had finally made it up the driveway. They rushed past him with hoses and axes, but Gerald didn't see them. He walked straight toward Mark. His son was sitting in the snow, the briefcase forgotten at his side. When he saw Gerald, Mark scrambled to his feet, a look of desperate hope crossing his face. "Dad, you did it. You saved the house. We can fix this. I can call the lawyers. We can say the data was corrupted by the fire. We can." Gerald stopped inches from Mark's face. The smell of smoke and scorched wool clung to him like a shroud. "The house is saved, Mark," Gerald said, his voice as quiet and cold as the ice forming on the trees. "But you aren't." "What?" "The evidence didn't burn. It's already everywhere. The truckers, the investors, the banks, they know. They're coming for the deed, the cars, and the clothes on your back." Elena began to wail, a high, thin sound that was lost in the wind. Mark grabbed Gerald's lapels, his voice breaking. "You can't do this. I'm your son. Where am I supposed to go? We have nothing." Gerald reached into his pocket. For a moment, Mark thought he was reaching for a checkbook or a key. Instead, Gerald pulled out the head of the porcelain ballerina. He placed it in Mark's hand. "While I was in that basement," Gerald said, "I learned that some things are too broken to be repaired. You didn't just throw me out, Mark. You threw away the only man who knew how to keep your world from burning. Gerald turned his back on them. He walked toward Elias's truck. Dad, wait. You can't leave us like this. Mark screamed, his voice cracking with the realization that the junk he had discarded was the only thing that had ever truly held him up. Gerald paused at the truck door. He looked back at the mansion, the beautiful, hollow shell of his life's work. I'm not leaving you, Gerald said. I'm just finishing the job. I'm clearing the clutter. The hook of part 6 came as Gerald started the engine. As he backed the truck away, he saw a line of black SUVs pulling up behind the fire trucks. Not the police, not the SEC. It was the creditors and the private investigators. Mark and Elena were standing in the middle of the yard, illuminated by the red and blue strobes of the emergency lights. They had a mansion behind them that they no longer owned, and a world in front of them that no longer believed a word they said. Gerald drove past the gates. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He had one more part to play. He had a city to help rebuild, and a group of obsolete men waiting for him in a warehouse. As he reached the main road, he reached into his pocket and wound the small music box Martha had loved. The melody of Claire de Lune filled the cabin of the truck, steady and unbreakable. The repairman had finished his greatest work. He had finally fixed the one thing that mattered, the truth. And as the music played, Gerald Bennett finally let out a long, slow breath. And for the first time in 65 years, he felt completely free. The industrial district was no longer a graveyard of rusted iron. Under Gerald's quiet, firm leadership, the warehouse had transformed into the restoration center. It wasn't just a workshop, it was a beacon. While the high-tech firms uptown were still reeling from the digital blackout, the center was thriving. They didn't use proprietary clouds or fragile algorithms. They used the Ghost Network, a system built on integrity, maintained by men who knew how to fix a machine with their bare hands. Gerald sat in his new office, which was nothing more than a glass-walled corner of the warehouse floor. He liked the noise, the rhythmic hiss of pneumatic drills, the smell of ozone, and the low murmur of veteran engineers teaching apprentices the art of the manual override. He looked down at his desk. There, sitting in a patch of morning sunlight, was the music box. It was perfect. The mahogany glowed, and the ballerina twirled with a grace that seemed to defy the trauma of her past. Gerald? Elias walked in, carrying a thick stack of legal documents. He looked younger, his eyes bright with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. The final transition is complete. The court has approved the conversion of the Bennett mansion. Gerald took the papers. He didn't look at the financial figures. He looked at the blueprint attached to the back. The mansion, the place where he had been discarded, was no longer a private residence. It had been gutted and rebuilt as a community tech hub and a residence for the elderly who had been displaced by the economic crash. And my son? Gerald asked, his voice steady. Elias sighed, leaning against the doorframe. Mark and Elena are living in a small apartment in the suburbs. The bankruptcy court left them enough to survive, but not much else. Mark is working as a junior data entry clerk for one of the shipping companies he used to try and disrupt. He's learning what it's like to be a cog in a machine he doesn't control. Gerald nodded. He felt no surge of triumph, no heat of vengeance. He felt only the cool, quiet satisfaction of a job finished. He's learning the value of a day's work. That's a better education than I ever gave him. He came by yesterday, Elias added hesitantly. He didn't come inside. He just stood at the gate, watching the trucks go out. He looked smaller, Gerald. He asked if you were here. I told him you were busy. I am, Gerald said, standing up. I have a class to teach. He walked out onto the warehouse floor. A group of 20-year-olds, kids who had been told they were unemployable because they didn't have degrees in AI, were gathered around a 1970s-era turbine. They looked at Gerald with a reverence that Mark had never shown. Tools down, Gerald commanded softly. The apprentices looked up. Today, Gerald said, picking up a rusted, seized-up valve from the table, we aren't going to talk about code. We aren't going to talk about efficiency or profit margins. We're going to talk about the point of failure. He held the valve up. Every system, whether it's made of steel or human relationships, has a point where it snaps. If you hide the cracks with paint, the system will eventually kill you. If you ignore the friction, it will burn you. Your job as a repairman isn't just to make things work. Your job is to make things honest. While he spoke, He looked through the large warehouse windows. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of the city skyline. It looked different now. More fragile, perhaps, but also more real. The hook of the finale came as a young woman in the back row raised her hand. "Mr. Bennett? My grandfather used to work for you. He said you once told him that everything can be fixed. Is that really true? Even the things that were meant to stay broken?" Gerald looked at his hands. The scars from the basement fire were now faint, silver lines. He thought about the night in the storm, the heat of the gas fire, and the look in Mark's eyes when the world collapsed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, brass gear, the one he had cleaned, tooth by tooth, while his son's empire fell. "Everything can be fixed," Gerald said, his voice echoing through the vast, industrial space. "But you have to be willing to get your hands dirty. You have to be willing to look at the rot and not turn away. And most importantly," he paused, a faint, wise smile touching his lips, "you have to understand that the most important part of any machine isn't the part that moves. It's the part that holds. It's the foundation. If the foundation is built on a lie, the repair isn't finished until you tear it down and start again." He handed the brass gear to the girl. "Keep this. It's a reminder that even the smallest part has to be true." As the class began, Gerald walked back toward his office. The music box began to play, not because he had wound it, but because the vibrations of the heavy machinery on the floor had triggered the delicate spring. Claire de Lune drifted through the warehouse, a silver thread of melody weaving through the roar of the engines. Gerald looked out at the street. People passing by, cars moving, life continuing. The world hadn't stopped. It had simply responded. It had moved toward the light, away from the shadows of the visionaries, and back toward the hands of the builders. He had spent his entire life building things that last. And in the end, he realized that the mansion, the money, and the titles were just clutter. The only thing that truly lasted, the only thing that was ever worth repairing, was the truth. Gerald stood for a moment, listening to the music and the machinery. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He wasn't a relic. He was the architect of the aftermath. "Done," he whispered to the air, not out of anger, not out of pride, but because there was finally nothing left to say. The repairman had finished his shift, and for the first time in a very long time, the world felt like it was running exactly as it was designed to.